Hey there, Alex Kidman here. My first tech video for a little while. I've been traveling. And today I'm looking at a Samsung phone, but not yet the S24 Ultra. That's going to be in a couple of weeks' time because I've been traveling largely, and I want to make sure that I do that review right. Instead, today I'm looking at this, the considerably cheaper than the S24 Ultra Samsung Galaxy A05s. Heck of a name, but the A series bit is the important bit there because Samsung's Galaxy A phones are its more affordable range, and this is one of the most affordable. Here in Australia, it'll start at $249 or $299 for a slightly larger storage model, and that puts it in direct competitive space with the likes of Nokia and Motorola and other manufacturers. But how well does it compare? Well, I've been testing it out for quite some time. In fact, I've been testing it out while I've been traveling, and there are some really great things about this phone and a few areas where it's definitely lacking. Let's get into it. So, while Samsung's not asking for a lot of money for the Galaxy A05s, first impressions are that you're actually getting a decent amount of phone, or at least a decent amount of screen real estate. The Galaxy A05s is built around a 6.7-inch display, and that's quite large for this price. Remember, with phone displays, you are always talking about measurements on the diagonals, so the difference between a 6.3 or a 6.5 and a 6.7 are actually bigger in the hand than you might expect. Resolution is decent, although there's no sign of fast refresh rates, which you can get in some phones at this price point, 90Hz or 120Hz. This is just a fixed 60Hz phone. Faster refresh rates are always nicer, but this is quite a pleasant panel to use. It's quite nice. I mean, Samsung does that, although it should be noted that this is just an LCD display, not an AMOLED, as you might see with some slightly higher priced Samsung phones. Samsung loves itself a hyperbolic suffix for its smartphone colors, but for the A05s, you've only got the one. It's awesome black. I'm not entirely sure what makes it awesome, although black is a nice neutral color. It kind of goes with pretty much every phone. You could always, if you can find one, throw a case on it, and that's always what I suggest anyway. The design itself is very Galaxy. I mean, you could actually fool people, if they weren't looking too close, into thinking that this was a more expensive phone. You know, triple lenses out the back, nice large display, clearly a Samsung. It's got all the hallmarks of it, although if they look a bit closer, they'll spot a few things which give away its budget status. First of all, there's the fact that at the base, you get a 3.5mm headphone jack. Now, that's a bit more common in the budget space than in the mid-range or high-end these days. And I've got to say, I don't entirely know why. My head wants to say that if you're going to have a feature, maybe that feature costs money and therefore the more expensive phones would have it and the cheaper ones wouldn't. But it's not the case here. You've got a headphone jack if you want one. It's just down the bottom near the USB-C power jack. Up on the right-hand side, you've got a combination power button and fingerprint sensor, which works reasonably well. It's not the fastest to unlock, but I've hit relatively few problems with it actually unlocking the phone, with that kind of false negative thing that you sometimes get with some of these thinner power button sensors, and then just standard volume controls. On the left-hand side, you get a genuine rarity in the budget space these days because it's actually got a triple tray, so 2 nano SIMs plus microSD expansion. The microSD expansion, I think, is going to be quite important, but it's always nice to see that kind of flexibility in a phone. It just gives you lots of choices, and lots of choices in budget land is not always the story that's told. In camera terms then, you've got triple lenses out the back. Sounds pretty good, sounds pretty neat, right? Well, it is and it isn't. Because as with all budget phones, you've got to temper your expectations somewhat. What we're talking about here is a primary 50-megapixel sensor. That's the one you'll be doing most of your shooting with, alongside 2-megapixel macro and 2-megapixel depth sensors. Now, the depth sensor, of course, you never shoot with. The 2-megapixel macro is there, but like pretty much every 2-megapixel macro on a cheap phone these days, it's not much cop. You'll struggle to get really pleasing shots out of it. And that means that you're mostly talking about that 50-megapixel sensor. And look, I put this to the test, traveling around, and the results I got were fairly good at this price range, and that's a terribly, terribly qualified point. I will throw up, of course, images here so you can see what I saw out of it. Basically, this shoots fairly well in most circumstances. That 50 megapixel sensor allows it a certain degree of telephoto, although of course that's just a digital crop. There's no actual telephoto lens in this thing. The default is 2 times, which is okay. If you push it up to its maximum of 10 times, though, it drops a lot of detail. I'm going to suggest that if you want to do that kind of cropping, do it in post-processing, do it in a dedicated app. You'll get a better result that way. Samsung's post-processing is important here because it does this quite well on its more premium phones, and it does it reasonably well here. A lot of the classic traps are still present, so low light's not brilliant, and actually even darker areas can suffer a bit in terms of the way they present shadows relative to other phones, but within this price space, it's decent. Not great, but decent, and that's about all you should shoot for this kind of money. If camera is really important to you, I'm seriously going to suggest save a bit more money, get something a bit more impressive, or maybe even a slightly older, more flagshipy phone, because some of those can be had for relatively modest sums. Not quite this cheap, but close. What about performance? Well, so this is where I don't like the Galaxy A05s quite as much. Samsung's rather coy when it comes to what the internal processor on the A05s actually is if you look at the Australian spec sheet, and that's a game it often plays. It just talks about it being an octa-core system. And look, what I've been able to ascertain looking at international spec sheets and running a few Android CPU identification apps, it's almost certainly the Qualcomm Snapdragon 680 sitting under the glass on this one. Now, that's a decent enough processor, but not exactly a new processor. And here in Australia, Samsung matches that up with just 4 gig of RAM. Now, 4 gig is pretty much my bottom line when it comes to Android phones that aren't Android Go phones these days. It'd be much better to see more. It appears there might be a 6 gig model in some international markets, so if you're watching this internationally, maybe you can do a little better, but here in Australia it's 4 gig only. So what does that actually do to the performance? Well, look, in the budget space, the A05s is not a strong competitor. It's capable enough. I have full benchmarks in my written review, which I'll link below if you care about such things. But the takeaway here is that while this will run most Android apps, it's not going to run them particularly fast, even relative to other phones that you can get in this price space. I'm thinking here of phones like the Motorola G54 5G, for example, which is very much within this price space. That's a faster phone than this is, albeit a little smaller, of course. I say most apps, but there's actually a specific class of apps for which this is incredibly poorly suited, and that's payments. And that's because Samsung's made the choice to completely omit NFC from this phone. I think that's a big failing for a modern smartphone because contactless payments and contactless authentication are a big deal, and this not having them is, I think, a big problem. A bigger problem, for example, than the fact that this is a 4G only phone. 5G would be nice to have. I would say NFC would be even more important, but it's just not here. There's no Google Pay, there's no Samsung Pay, and there never will be. So if that's important to you, this is not the phone to buy. One area where Samsung does do a lot better than its competition, and yes, Motorola, I'm looking at you, is in terms of upgrades. So the A05s is a budget phone, and often those do not see a lot of upgrades, but the promise here is for 2 full Android OS upgrades and 4 full years of security upgrades, and that's pretty good. Now, one caveat here, it launches with Android 13, and indeed the model that I've got right in my hand right now is Android 13 at the time of writing, which means Android 14, which was 2023's version of Android, is going to eat up one of those OS upgrades. Still, it is better than their competition is doing. Good work, Samsung. I love to see this kind of thing, especially in more affordable phones where people probably can't afford to upgrade quite as frequently. So keeping phones up to date and especially keeping them secure is really nice to see. On the battery front, the Galaxy A05s has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, which puts it in the exact same spot as just about every other non-folding Android phone you can buy right now. 5,000 is just the standard. So if you think that sounds like a big number, well, in one sense it is, but in one sense it's absolutely dead average too. But of course it's a question of what you do with it. Given that large screen, I had some concerns, but then the processor's not so fast, the screen doesn't do fast refresh rates, so there was some scope for decent battery life, and that's actually what you get. A 1-hour YouTube battery rundown test saw it lose only about 5% of its battery life. That's actually quite good in this class. And more anecdotal testing while I've been traveling suggests that, yeah, look, all-day battery life, fairly easy to achieve under most circumstances. Obviously, if you push a phone particularly hard, yeah, it can go flat within the day. But for most users, for everyday kind of average use, not a problem, quite an impressive performer in that respect. One thing I do tend to still see, though, in budget phones that's not with the Galaxy A05s is an included charger. Now, it can charge it up to 25 watts over USB-C, but you'll need to bring that with you. I'll leave that up to you as to whether or not that's a sensible inclusion or a bit of a missing puzzle piece, depending on your viewpoint, depending on how many chargers you have. So, should you buy the Samsung Galaxy A05s? Well, look, it depends on what you want out of a phone. On the plus side, the battery life's pretty good, the camera's fairly decent, and the screen is nice and large. And for some people, the screen being nice and large is actually going to be the killer feature for this particular phone. On the minus side, there's no NFC on board, the processor is a bit slower than its competition, there's no 5G. These are issues, I feel, and they are issues that mean that I think it's definitely worth shopping around. Now, if you can score this at a reasonable sort of price, and I'll point out that $249 asking price, that's the bottom line, that's the 64 gig model. The 128 gig model is the typically, in Australia, $299 model. But if you can score this at a bit of a discount, of course, it becomes that little bit more compelling. Up against its competition at regular retail price, I think it's a little bit more of a hard sell. But that's my take. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe.